This is a screencast about measuring concepts in quantitative research, including operationalizing variables. So qualitative research is about looking for the relationships between two or more variables. Variables are just concepts that we're moving away from a theoretical understanding of to an observation or data-based understanding of. And so that has to do with operationalizing or defining our concepts really well, our variables really well, in order to take our ideas from kind of expansive, ill-defined ideas into clearly defined realities. And quantitative researchers will tell you that this is about objectivity, so working to objectively measure things the same way. In my opinion, and some of the evidence from some researchers of other schools of thought, it's important, though, to look at what objectivity means and who gets to define objectivity. So this is another place where concepts from the social justice world are really important in the research world. Why is it that someone who is a researcher, why their definition of a concept is more real than another person who is not a researcher, especially given what we know about the privilege inherent in who becomes a researcher? So I'll talk a little bit more about measurement, and then we'll talk about variable types and move on to how we know that the variables we've selected or the measures we've selected are good. So measurement is the process of making distinctions, of accurately specifying and quantifying concepts or ideas into data and observations. And so variables, at the beginning of every study, it's really important to define your variables, or what's called operationalize your variables. So this involves putting value labels on variables, saying that, if your blood pressure is under 120/90, you have normal blood pressure. Normal blood pressure being the value label that we're putting on the variable of blood pressure. If your blood pressure is over 120/90, you have high blood pressure, high being the value label. Obviously, this is much more complex and harder to do in social science research and biological science research. We have these very precise numbers that make it easier to define our variables and put these value labels on them. And in general, when we're measuring a concept, it's important to know how it's been measured previously. So how does the previous literature define and measure your variables? So going back to the idea that quantitative research is looking at the relationship between variables, we often define the dependent and independent variables. And this is a way of exploring the relationship between two things. So the independent variable is something that just exists. It's independent. So I am either undead or not undead. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the thing that's being influenced by the independent variable. So if we change the independent variable, so I was an undead, and then I get the virus and I am now an undead individual, that's going to impact the dependent variable, which is whether or not I eat brains. So to measure relationships in quantitative research, we define an independent and dependent variable. Then we make changes to the independent variable and watch what happens to the dependent variable. So in intervention studies, the intervention is the independent variable. And the outcome we're looking for at the end of the intervention is the dependent variable. So if you're doing a study looking at whether giving classes to zombies about nutrition will stop them from eating brains, the intervention of that class is the independent variable. The outcome of whether or not zombies continue to eat brains after my class is the dependent variable. A predictive variable is a kind of independent variable that just means the independent variable came first. So again, it's not a guarantee or speaking definitively to causation, but it does have that time sequencing that we need for causation. So as you remember, in order to prove causation, we need to know that the independent variable came first, that there's a time relationship between the two variables. It's not that I, gained weight and then ate a bunch of Doritos. First I ate a bunch of Doritos, and then later on it impacted my weight. That we've removed confounding factors, and that there's a logical association between, for example, Doritos and weight. So in these example research questions, I want you to think about what is the independent variable and the dependent variable. So question 1, does playing Baby Mozart, if you remember those CDs with like classical music, and there was one called Baby Einstein, and the idea was that you would play these CDs. It was back in the day when CDs were a bigger thing. You'd play these CDs to your baby, and it would have a long-term impact on their IQ or intelligence. So in this question, does playing Baby Mozart for your kids make them more likely to read above grade level in 3rd grade? What's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable? So the independent variable is playing Baby Mozart for your kids. The dependent variable is their reading level in 3rd grade, because we're hypothesizing that their reading level in 3rd grade might be dependent on whether or not they listen to Baby Mozart. That has been disproven, for the record. Another example research question, does gender predict interest in science? So in this research question, gender's the independent variable. It's not that I would become interested in science and my gender would change, but does my gender itself, which is fixed, predict my level of interest in science, which can move up or down in response to gender. So it's important to note that gender is a part of our identity. So sometimes either variable can be an identity rather than an action or a score. Finally, the last example question, is there a relationship between the level of institutional racism at a university and the retention of faculty of color? So in this case, retention of faculty of color is the dependent variable. So the independent variable that we're moving around is the level of institutional racism. And so if we move the level of institutional racism down, does our dependent variable, retention of faculty of color, does that move up in response to changes in the independent variable? Confounding variables, we've talked about a little bit before, and we talk about in the screencast about bias. But confounders are things that impact both the independent variable and the dependent variable. So in other words, they muddy the water of evaluating the relationship between the independent and dependent variable because they impact both things. So with the question about does playing Baby Mozart for your kids make them more likely to read above grade level in 3rd grade, parental engagement and